Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. Today is International Jazz Day, so we're going to check out two jazz tracks today rather than the theme that we have, which is long band names. We'll continue that tomorrow, checking out two, and then that puts us back on track for one per day on Thursday and Friday. But today we're going to listen to, as I stated, two jazz tracks, and who better to kick it off than Kamasi Washington. We're going to be checking out the track Askim off of the album called The Epic. And speaking of epic, this song is epic at 12 and a half minutes. Let's dive into it, see what Kamasi has for us today. Yeah, we have a nice up-tempo 5/4 going on here. Really fun drum patterns. Now either I was feeling a polyrhythm or we have shifted to a 4/4. Very spicy. Bass doing some real cool stuff under this too. Strings are an interesting touch. Very intriguing pacing. It's also interesting to have such movement behind the soloist. lifting a bit out of whatever solemnness we were in. The sax just bringing us in the positivity here. Oh, the slight delay on that. Sitting in this sound for so long. Bring the energy back way down. Bringing it back. Counterpoint during a jazz solo. Love those piano runs. That's just gorgeous. Dude, the transformation of that one line. What is that ending? Alright, so this is awesome. Alright, because it is what I want out of exploring jazz. And I know there's probably quite a few of you who want me to explore some of the jazz highlights over the past century, or popular jazz standards. I saw quite a few people recommending Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis. Makes sense, right? Especially with me being a trumpet player, I probably have some insight on some of that y'all are looking forward to. But like, I've also heard a lot of that a lot of times. Being a jazz trumpet player, I had to listen to a lot of that stuff. So it's not really a first time reaction for me, and some of it I'm kind of tired of. I've made this clear before, right? I'm not a huge fan of the idea of jazz standards. I want to see where jazz progresses. I'm tired of jazz being stuck in the past. And it's why I'm all for introducing jazz into other styles, or introducing it to new audiences, smashing it together in modern ways. It's why, even though La Fée isn't really jazz, I'm really glad to see what she's doing and bringing people to jazzier sounds. And so I'm really glad that to celebrate International Jazz Day, we're checking out something like this. That I had to go to Rate Your Music to see what genre the Rate Your Musicites decided to put this under. Because it's not jazz. It's jazzy. There are a lot of jazz components to it, but this is so far divorced from traditional jazz. This is very forward reaching, and I love it. They have it classified primarily as spiritual jazz, with some secondary genres being soul jazz, jazz fusion, and post bop, which is really cool. Uh, I've never heard jazz like this, which is, again, to me, very exciting. I think first I want to start with what is jazz within the song, of course, not generally speaking. And then we'll move to what isn't jazz. And then some more subjective things. So let's kick this off. What is jazzy here? We have a very standard jazz setup as far as structure to an extent. We kick it off with the A section, which is the melody, the main lick. We get that a couple of times, and then we go into the solo section. This is our AAB. Normally, in jazz standards, after this B, after we have a few people solo, we'll come back to the main melody to wrap the track up. Sometimes we'll use that as an interlude to go into some more solos, but then, yet again, we come back to the A section, the main lick, to wrap the song up. The main conceit is melody, solo, melody. Usually, again, twice on the melody. To start with AABA. That's the ABABCB of jazz. And we kind of explore a little bit of that here. We kick off with some pre-composed, I assume, melody writing that a lot of the band gets to participate in. We have a pretty standard rhythm section underneath that. We have piano, bass, drums. The bass does a lot of chordal or harmonic ideas. The piano does some vamping, little ornamental things, and the drum is pretty light. It does veer a little bit more into rock style of drumming with some really cool snare accents that is very not jazzy. Jazz, particularly swing, likes to emphasize cymbal work rather than tom, snare, and bass kick. And this kind of takes more of that rock approach of having that snare emphasis and the bass kick emphasis. But it does have some jazzier ideas, and we do have some swing feeling at the beginning of this track. And swing is just when you have the way that you subdivide notes is that they're not even. So eighth notes is 2 notes per beat. If they were even, bop, 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 bop. Swing, we give a little bit of emphasis. Bop, ba, up, ba, up, ba, up, ba, up, ba, up, ba, up. The second one's a bit shorter, the first one's a bit longer. A neat little tidbit of information here is that while you can rhythmically write out swung notes, normally, if you're playing swing, you get to sheet music in front of you, the notes are written as normal eighth notes, and somewhere on the paper, usually at the top, a note will be stated that you're playing in swing style, your eighth notes are swung, something along those lines, to let you know that even though it's written as 2 equal length notes, you are supposed to swing them. You're supposed to give that rhythmic weighting. So that's a neat little fun fact for people who haven't played swing or don't read sheet music or whatever. So yeah, that's all mostly jazzy, and then we get to the solo sections, and this is all mostly jazzy. We have what I think is the keyboard to kick us off with. It does sound like a finger plucked string instrument, but there is something about the way that the notes change that's very rough, very strict and sudden, that to me sounds like a keyboard. But it's a really interesting sound that they're getting out of the keyboard, and that I can kind of hear a plucked finger-picked string instrument particularly. There's something very soft about the attacks on them. But I do think at the end of the day it sounds just a bit too digitized to be a string instrument that's gone through distortion and modulation, electronic elements, I suppose we can put on it. Regardless, we kick off with this, and yeah, I mean, this is a very jazzy solo. There's some spicy harmonies in here, there's coloring outside the lines, and some really interesting phrasing to it all as well. Unlike rock and metal guitar solos, and even bass solos, and honestly, even drum solos, they just tend to keep going. Jazz, something that really separates jazz soloing from rock and metal soloing, at least for me, is pacing, utilizing rests. Music, of course, is a combination of sounds and silence. Rock and metal just don't really utilize silence too often, whereas jazz, particularly in solos, do. I think a lot of this comes from the fact that most of your jazz band is aerophone. It's trumpets, trombones, saxophones, sometimes flutes, clarinets. They're instruments that require wind. They require the person to breathe. And so there's this naturally occurring element where they're going to stop playing in order to live, to play the next phrase. And this just kind of got incorporated even into instruments like the bass or the electric guitar or the piano or keyboards or whatever, where you don't necessarily need to breathe or to create these rests, but it's just part of the way that melodies get phrased. And we have plenty of that in here. But what I find interesting is that the phrasing is, I can never quite guess when it's going to happen, when these pauses or the breaks between ideas is going to happen. They seem to extend ideas past where I think that they should have ended, or cut an idea short and then just take like 2 or 3 seconds to break before moving to something else. It almost feels as if maybe they started an idea and didn't really know where to take it, so they just stopped playing and decided to go for a fresh start sometimes. I don't know if that's necessarily what happened. I mean, there's so much that goes into jazz soloing, and even something like this technically fits on the more avant-garde or experimental side of jazz, that having these more experimental, or I guess just less traditional phrasing ideas in the solo fits really well with how the general writing is going. So I can't really say that it's any of that. And I don't know how many takes this was, too. If I go see a live show and the solos are a bit iffy, yeah, maybe the guy was having a rough night. But this is a studio recording. I have to assume that this could have had another take if they weren't happy with it. And so they must have been happy with it. And again, that just kind of leaves me with the idea of what's going on with this phrasing. It's interesting. It kind of baffles me, and it never quite works in a way that I felt was conducive to the general storytelling the keyboardist had. And it wasn't all the time. It was just frequent enough for me to say, oh, there's another interesting stopping point. But there were so many good passages coming out of the keyboardist too. It was just really difficult for me to follow along. Instead of being told a really good story, it felt like I was being told jokes in a sense. Not that they were comical, but that they all seemed to be separate from each other, right? It's not like a comedian who gets up there and tells a set where everything's sort of interconnected and the punchline on like the fifth joke calls back to how the whole thing started. There's any of this interconnectedness. It's somebody who gets up there and tells jokes, like a Mitch Hedberg, maybe. They're not really interconnected, they're just individual ideas. And that's sort of how I feel about this. Some of the ideas work a lot better for me, but I had a really tough time being on the ride for the whole thing. This actually stands in drastic opposition to what I assume is Kamasi's solo, since it was on the saxophone and this is his group, which seemed to be entirely cohesive, almost as if it was pre-composed, and I honestly don't know if it was or wasn't, but I also have a very strong, uh, what would you even call it? Like, the way that I see Kamasi is that he's a visionary. He's just a genius in the jazz space, and for him to have composed something of this caliber on the fly is not something that I think is beneath him. I think he has the capability to do this. Regardless, it is entirely cohesive. Everything blends into the next. He seems to have an idea of what's going to happen 3 bars ahead of where he's at, and he knows how to get there. And by the time he's there, he's already started thinking and crafted a plan of how to get to the next 3 bars. It is masterful. Now, I don't think all of it is improvised. There is, of course, everything that happens underneath these solos that is pre-composed, but there's also, I don't know if I want to jump off of this section so quickly, but there's also the counterpoint. Yeah, I don't want to dive into that too much yet, but more sections of this I feel were pre-composed because that counterpoint just worked way too well. Coming back to Kamasi's solos though, yeah, just everything works. The buildup of energy, the release of energy, the way that he utilizes some really neat notes outside of the current scale that he's in order to lead into the next chord and the chord after that and the chord after that, pulling in these ideas almost as foreshadowing to where we are going. Again, always living one or two steps in the future while keeping one foot in the present in order to, you know, build into these ideas. It is masterful. And it's not even just about the notes themselves, but about the performance, how these notes are being played. At one point, the saxophone sounds like it's screaming. I really love this. He put so much emotion and passion into the raw delivery of it. It got to a point where it was just this one phrase over and over, except the third note that he held out continued to rise in pitch on every repetition. It made it sound more and more desperate to me. I don't necessarily think desperation is the direction it wanted to go in, but that's how I felt it. Because we'll get to this later, but everything underneath did not say desperation to me, but this saxophone was really reaching a peak of intensity, if nothing else. What that intensity represents, I think, is going to be different from listener to listener and even different from listener to performer. Kamasi might have had a totally different approach to why he wanted to go for this note, this style, this delivery. To me, I felt desperation, a feeling overcome of intense, I don't know. Again, just raw intensity. I think that is the most objective take I can have for it. And as we reach a peak, slowly bring it back down. And we have a return to form. I find this to be really interesting because this return to form introduces some of the ideas from the beginning of the solo, and then this is where the counterpoint begins to come in, and we're pushing towards the final 2 minutes of the track, and things need to start wrapping up here. It was a fascinating solo, first of all, just in general, but a fascinating section and a fascinating counter to the keyboardist's solo. It's really interesting to have them back to back, not necessarily in the purpose of comparing them, but yeah, for me to see these two different styles work well within pretty much the same framework. And of course, that framework begins the conversation of the non jazz elements here. There is movement underneath the solo sections. I found this to be odd the first time through, but it all clicked the second time through under Kamasi's solo. The drums begin to increase in intensity, pulling in more and more rock ideas as far as patterns and general intensity goes. How hard the drums are being hit, what parts of the kit are being used. Following alongside this, the horns come in, giving us louder licks. It's not uncommon in jazz, usually at the end of maybe 8 bars or maybe the end of 16 bars to introduce the next soloist, for the horns to have a little, I don't know, 2 to 4 beat idea, sort of punctuating notes in the middle of a solo section to sort of break things up a little bit. No different than how at the end of a 16 beat phrase in like a rock track, the drummer might put a drum fill in there just to change things up a little bit and create this ending so that we can loop back to the beginning and it doesn't feel like this big cyclical thing. We can break it up into these ideas. It's what I call them is punctuating licks. It's an idea that sort of puts a period at the end of a place and allows us to start a new sentence. That new sentence is might be very similar to the one we just played, or the one we just stated. But we at least have this moment here. Run-on sentences can become difficult to read. It becomes this blur of ideas, and music is sort of the same way. And that's what these punctuating licks do. Jazz has these as well. And it's typically the horns who come in and do a nice little thing here just to break up the sound and to introduce something new and create this moment of ending so that we can start it fresh. Except they don't really do that for that purpose. The horns come in and it feels like that's what they're doing, but then they keep playing. And then the unusual thing happens. Strings and choir jump in and give us these very spiritual, hymnic chord progressions behind the solo. These two instruments grow in size and volume, the chords becoming more tense and powerful and emotional, the horns rising with all of it, almost to a point that it overshadows the keyboard and then dissipates. The keyboard again is alone with the rhythm section to play what they want. I was kind of taken aback by this at first. It's so unusual for this style, and up until this point, aside from the heavier drumming, nothing really seemed out of place for a jazz track. I found it interesting then when it came back and did it again. It was not a one-time thing, but a recurring component of the solo section. I still don't think it worked fantastically with the keyboards. It was a neat idea, but one that never really shone through the purpose of it. That is until Kamasi's solo. We get the build up under it, and the saxophone rises along with it rather than being swallowed up like the keyboardist did. The solo, or the saxophone stands up and says, I will meet this challenge, and I will play as loud as you all do. And that's where we get this really expressive saxophone work. And again, it feels like this overwhelming tension, which makes sense. It's being enveloped, or it's trying to be enveloped by this, all of this noise sitting outside of it. And it's trying so hard to be as loud as all of that, to stand out, to not be consumed. As soon as all of the noise dies down, the saxophone does as well. It can relax. It can do something that feels a bit more natural. It doesn't have to yell anymore. This is where, for me, a story began to form. I found this to be beautiful to listen to. I'm kind of surprised, given what I was feeling during it, that I didn't start to tear up like I have before in other, well, honestly, other avant-garde jazzier stuff, like when we checked out Floating Points and Pharoah Sanders, is that right? There was a point, and I think it was a saxophone there too, towards the end of the song, that I just couldn't hold anything back. Tears just started forming. It was a very powerful piece, and this feels like it should have been too. I'm very surprised that I never even got a notion, a little part of my brain, hey, bro, maybe we should cry at this. Aren't you feeling overwhelmed? Little tears welling up? Never happened. It certainly sounds, or it feels like the kind of song that would do that to me. But what I find really interesting is after this point, the saxophone stands their ground, refuses to be consumed by the noise around them, defeats them, and is allowed to be themselves once again, to be comfortable. And at this point, we get a counterpoint, a second element that I've just don't hear in jazz solos too often, particularly because good counterpoint is pre-composed. The idea that two melodies would need to work around and off of each other in order to create beautiful duality. both in tension and release, working against each other and within each other, filling in the spaces of another harmonically or rhythmically. It's really difficult to do that with two people in real time unless you mind meld, and I don't know that we've come to that science yet. I suppose that would be one cool thing if we ever do create drifting a la Pacific Rim, is taking that technology and putting it towards the arts. Something I kind of wish they might have explored a little bit. Pacific Rim, now that I'm thinking about it. There's no room in that movie for it. It's like 2 hours long or something. But still, that it would be really cool to see how that technology got pushed outside of the middle. I'm way off topic here. Improvisational counterpoint is not easy. It makes me think that it was pre-composed, and there are pre-composed elements to the track, so I don't think it's that far outside of the box to think that that's what happened. Regardless, it is just not something you hear too often in jazz, and I found myself enjoying it quite a bit. It takes one of the things I love about classical music and incorporating it into jazz, two of my favorite styles of music, and taking one of my favorite things, or actually kind of taking my favorite things of both of them, the solos and the complex melody writing, and putting them together. It is fantastic. And to me, it feels like battling anxiety, coming out the other side a better, more complete person, and finding somebody who compliments you now that you have confidence. I have no idea if that's actually what's going on here. It probably isn't. But I like that little narrative I got from it. It's a beautiful little thing. I suppose the last thing that I should bring up is time. I'm still not 100% sure what's going on in the meter of this track. A lot of the sections can be clearly felt and counted in 4/4, but I can also force a 5 polyrhythm in a lot of them that doesn't feel completely out of place. It might not be heavily emphasized, but it sort of works, and it makes me wonder if there isn't some 5 against 4 idea that's being presented throughout here, where some sections emphasize the 5 more than the 4, and others emphasize the 4 more than the 5. There are some interesting tempo shifts throughout here. One particularly that happens often is when we go from a faster groove, probably something around the 190 BPM, somewhere around there, and pull it back just a hair bit, maybe dropping 20 BPM or so. We do this often. The faster section, sometimes I can count out in the 5, but the slower one is always in 4. And so it feels to me like there is a massive reduction in speed, because we're also lessening how many accented areas we have in each bar, but we're also lowering the tempo of it, which just feels like a double whammy of less notes per bar, or less notes per second, I guess we can say. And I find that to be a really cool idea. And it's something I want to incorporate more in my work. Usually I think about tempo and time mostly separate. Tempo is a speed feeling and time is a rhythmic feeling, but they can certainly be combined and compounded on, or they can be combined in order to compound time feel. And I think that's what happens a lot in here. I find it to be really genius. It makes these slower sections feel even slower, even though there probably isn't that big of a difference. As I said, maybe just about 20 BPM difference. But it feels so much slower. And I think a lot of that comes down to changing the time signature alongside it, or at least the time feel. Again, the sections, the whole song might be in 4/4, but we do subdivide into 5 in a couple of places. I do have a bit of criticism, though. It feels very indulgent, especially towards the end of the song. I'm not necessarily sure that it justifies a 12 and a half minute runtime. There are two particular sections, one in Kamasi's solo and one towards the end, I guess it would be the outro, that I feel like they went on just a hair bit too long, repeating an idea over and over and over and over and over. I had certainly had my fill in those two moments and was ready for whatever would happen next, and kind of felt like it just never came. It's a small criticism, I think. I did enjoy, generally, the first 7 to 8 minutes of this track. It's really only the end, the final quarter of it, that fatigue began to set in, and a lot of it comes down not to the structure of the song or the pacing of the overall experience, but pacing of singular ideas. We just hit a lot of repetition towards the end, and I feel like there's supposed to be purpose to it, much like the overwhelming string and choir coming in under the sax solo, and the sax repeating this idea over and over, almost trying to justify its existence with this one phrase, some sort of mantra, possibly. The other sections of heavy repetition don't quite carry that narrative weight to me. Maybe if I understood what Kamasi's intentions were behind them, I might come around to them, but just on a first time listen, lacking the context of the authorial intent, they just sort of kept happening. They didn't really mean anything the first time. They didn't mean anything the 10th time. And I was happy when they were over and we decided to proceed to the next idea. Again, though, I think it's such a small complaint when I enjoyed so much of this track to say that, there was a combined 30 some odd seconds in here out of a 12-minute song that I felt was just a bit too repetitious. So, I don't know. Might not even be worth bringing up, but I did, so I guess I'm stuck with that. That's my opinion. It's out there in the ether now. No lyrics to this one, so let's wrap it up. Those are my thoughts on Kamasi Washington's Askim. What did you think of this track? Was there anything that stood out to you? Anything you'd like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Maybe you just have your own isolated thoughts, opinions, or perspectives about it completely devoid of what mine were. You can toss all that stuff down in the comments section. Above that, in the description box, there's a link for Linktree. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for this one. We do have one more jazz track we're going to check out today. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow. We're going to push forward with our long band name theme. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.